Maya, let me ask you about your job title. There are many things you could have called yourself, and you chose neuroscience journalist. What does that mean?
Well, I made the term up, but it basically means that I focus on brain and behavior and how they interact with culture and how we understand the science of ourselves.
Still got another hum.
Yeah, that is a loud hum.
Can we fix that? It's going to be ugly for your table floor. We still got.
Is this?
Oh, it's that.
Okay, all right, this has got to go, sorry. How does this come up? It's magnetic. Okay.
Okay.
That's all
Bring
that?
me up a little bit.
Yeah, okay.
It's the same on
All right, well, I
a
guess.
great line of comedy.
Okay,
Okay, how's that? That's good.
all right.
You've got a future in this, Jason. Okay. Why did you choose neuroscience journalist?
Well, it is a term that I made up, but it's because I'm interested in brain and behavior and culture and how that interacts with psychology, basically the science of the self and our community. Oh, sorry. Okay,
Yeah.
I will try to speak up, and is that better? Sure. Okay, great. So, yes.
Right. What does that approach when you come to it from the perspective that it's about brain and behaviour? What does that bring to the field of drug regulation and support?
Science, hopefully. I am actually a former cocaine and heroin addict, and when I was taking drugs in my 20s, I learned a whole set of myths about drugs on the street. And then when I went into treatment, I learned another whole set of myths about drugs. And it wasn't until I started studying the science that I began to understand what was true and what was false and what made sense in this area. So it's sort of been a long journey for me.
So the original motivation was myth busting.
Yes, and that is what I have tried to do as much as possible throughout my career. In fact, my very first article for the Village Voice back in 1990 was about needle exchange from the drug user's perspective and why, back then there was a myth that addicts like to share needles and we're supposed to be evil, selfish, horrible people otherwise, but suddenly it was peace and love when it came to needles. And that was ridiculous. People don't like to share needles, and it was about economic necessity. So that's where I started, and I've just been trying to bring some common sense and science to this area ever since.
How much of a problem is it that the still prevalent media perception is that taking drugs is something bad or damage to people do?
It's a huge problem because every human culture, and even before humans evolved, creatures have been getting high. You've got cats and catnip. You've got horses and loco weed. Lots of different creatures take things in order to alter their states of consciousness, and there has not been a single human culture ever discovered that doesn't do this. So the idea that this is some kind of a bad activity that only bad, horrible people do is ridiculous, given that 50% of the American population anyway is physically dependent on caffeine, 80% use alcohol, 20% use cigarettes, at least 50% have tried marijuana. It's just very silly. Now, addiction is a serious health problem, but again, and there certainly are overrepresentations of people with antisocial personality disorder among people with addictions, but that doesn't mean all addicts are bad antisocial people.
Is that why you're so frank about your own past drug use and addiction?
Yeah, a lot of people don't think of me as the typical drug user or the typical addict, and over the course of researching and writing about this for years, I've discovered that the typical drug addict stereotype is identical to the typical racist stereotype of many different people of color, and it's offensive to me. So I try to avoid this typical addict thing. And, you know, whenever we see drug users as disenfranchised, marginalized people, we make these horrible, harsh laws about them. And when we see them as us, it's suddenly like, oh, they need treatment. And it's, you know, I mean, one of the reasons I was interested in coming here and learning about your Psychoactive Substances Act is that nowhere in the entire history of the world's regulation of substances has it ever been based on science. We got the cocaine laws in the United States because we were afraid that cocaine made black people impervious to bullets and prone to raping white women. We got the opium laws in the United States because we thought that it made Chinese men able to seduce white women. We got the marijuana laws in the United States because according to Harry Anslinger, who pushed those laws, because of its effect on the degenerate races and the fact that it made white women sleep with jazz musicians. So, do you think white men have an issue? But anyway, but you know, when you look at the history of these laws, it's offensive.
And the interesting thing is that legalization of cannabis in Colorado and Washington State hasn't come about by virtue of evidence or any kind of state process either. They were referendum.
No, and I mean, I think it's clearly the case that in the history of cannabis use, there is lots of good evidence that it is less harmful than the currently legal substances. But yes, this was not a, let's check off which substance should be legal based on, you know, 5 categories of harm.
How well has it been done? I talked to Mark Kleiman, who's the pot czar in Washington State, as he was preparing, you know, the regulations there, and I was impressed by the degree of detail. And when you look at someone like Kleiman, he's been studying this, he's been preparing for this day for 20 years.
Yes, although he was originally an opponent of any type of legalization, so he's shifted a bit over time. He was originally an opponent of needle exchange. Yeah, so he has, and I say this, I think he's a great, very smart, interesting guy that I've worked with, but it's like his position has evolved based on the data, and I am sure to some extent based on the politics as well.
I was interested that speaking to Kleiman and pretty much to anyone else, no one was prepared to look at going forward from the philosophy they were taking to marijuana and applying it to any other currently illicit drug. He really did not want to go there. He didn't talk about it. I mean, is that
I think
pretty much the current setting there?
American drug politics has been coming from a position of absolute drug war for so long that anybody who works in the field, and he's an academic who's, you know, and I'm just not saying this, I could say this about anybody in the entire American drugs field, so please don't take this as a criticism of Mark Kleiman, because I think he's a lovely person and he's a friend, I don't want to. But everybody is influenced by the political climate there. And for so long, it has been the case that if you even said the word legalization, you were seen as so far extreme that nobody would pay attention to you at all. And what's interesting to me now is that suddenly a lot of the absolute prohibitionists on marijuana are all in favor of decriminalization because locking up drug users doesn't do any good. Well, if locking up drug users for marijuana doesn't do any good, why does it do good for other drugs? So we're in a strange evolving time around this.
Does that argument get maybe more space in the media than it used to? I get the impression that the media environment about discussion of these issues has improved in the US. The sheer fact that you get to write the Time magazine.
Yeah, I think what has happened, I think several things have happened. One is that among people in their 20s and 30s and younger, the dirty hippie argument doesn't work anymore. And therefore we're left with marijuana is illegal. Why? So, you know, with the baby boomers, they were indoctrinated, and so was my generation X, indoctrinated, drugs are bad, drugs are evil, drugs are horrible, and, you know, all this propaganda. By the time it got to the next generations, people could just see for themselves that this was ridiculous. And there wasn't all the hysteria around crack to distract them. and we have a little bit of an economic crisis. So we can't afford to keep locking up black people, basically. So I think all of these factors have come together to make the media a little more skeptical. I think the media was always lined up harsh with the drug warriors. I think, and I could be totally wrong, but a lot of journalists have taken drugs themselves, and I don't think they wanted to be straightforward about that.
It seems that it's now also acceptable in the US to start talking about harm reduction as the preferred strategy, which is a big change. You're now actually looking at having more needle exchanges, which was really difficult for them, isn't it?
Well, as the person who wrote the first-person argument for needle exchange back in 1990, the fact that we still don't have congressional funding, federal funding for it after all of these years, despite, the World Health Organization, the Institute of Medicine, the Centers for Disease Control, the National Institute of Health, every organized body of scientists that has ever looked at that question has said, we must do this, it works. So, yeah, the fact that we're still having this discussion is pathetic. But it is great to see harm reduction coming into the media because typically in the coverage of needle exchange in the 80s and 90s, we got all of this stuff about, well, all the science says this, but people say it'll encourage drugs, and this person says it'll encourage drugs, and that person, they had no data. It doesn't encourage drug use. Like, the fact that you see some horribly skinny, unhealthy-looking person going to some building to get a needle does not make kids say, yes, that's what I want to be when I grow up. It just doesn't work that way. And the idea that we should allow people to die as an example to others, what I am fascinated by is right now we are having a big problem with opioids in the United States, and huge overdose. Overdose is actually overtaken car accidents as the number one cause of accidental death.
Are you talking about illicit or prescription?
Both. It's driven by prescription, although the prescription use is not driven by medical use. The prescription use, 80% of the people who take opioids recreationally start out getting it from their medicine cabinet, getting it from a friend, getting it from a drug dealer. They are not getting it directly from doctors. So the idea that this is an epidemic caused by pain patients being turned into doctors, well, if that's the case and grandma, got something for her back pain, how did she suddenly go and find a cocaine dealer? Because 80% of these people have taken cocaine also. So, this is...
And yet that hasn't been the reaction. The reaction has been to crack down on pain patients, hasn't it?
No, and that's another whole terrible story. But what I was getting at here was that naloxone, which is the remedy for overdose, it's an antidote to opioids. It's completely non-toxic. If you are physically dependent on opioids, it will put you into withdrawal, which is not fun, but it will also keep you alive if you have overdosed. So there is now a huge movement to get naloxone, more available. I believe it should be available over the counter. I believe it should be in every first aid kit. But there has not been the arguments that are like, this will encourage drugs, this will encourage drugs. Very few people are making them, and I think one of the reasons that we're seeing such strong support for naloxone is that parents who lost kids are out there saying, why didn't I know about this? I knew my kid was in trouble. Why didn't somebody give me this? Why didn't I know about this when my kid was alive? And how do you answer that parent and say, well, we think that maybe somebody might have a seizure someday, so you shouldn't have access to the thing that could save their life? Like, there's actually no evidence that it causes seizures, but people, some doctors have claimed this probably because they want to keep their medical turf. So the fact that we didn't have parents of IV drug users coming out for needle exchange in the 80s and 90s, probably because they were so terrorized by the stigma, it's very different now, and I think that's part of the change. When you have parents not saying, come lock up my kids, it'll help them, you get a much better, sensible policy.
The quandary there that people do bring up is that we can talk about legalising drugs, and yet we have these legal, quite tightly controlled prescription opioids that have become a real problem. How do you square the circle there?
Well, I think the reality that people don't accept about drug problems is that about maybe up to 20% of the population. Varies with the drug, it varies with the amount of trauma in the population and all kinds of things like this. But people who have addictions are looking for escape. The drug is their solution. It's not their problem. It obviously becomes their problem. But the reason people take drugs excessively is because their lives are without meaning and purpose, and they are in pain, emotional pain. And if you take away all the drugs from somebody whose life is without meaning and purpose, and you don't give them anything else, they will become gamblers. They will, there's all, it's like you're not going to solve the problem by taking away the drugs. The demand is the problem, and the human desire to alter consciousness is the problem. So the reality is we're going to have people who are going to do this, and we're going to have people who are going to get in trouble no matter how good our regulations are. We could sure as heck do a lot better with alcohol and tobacco. And we can certainly do somewhat better with prescription opioids. I think the problem there is the fact that we really don't have good treatments for chronic pain, and there's a lot of people with chronic pain, and some of them are going to, benefit from opiates, and some of them are not. So, that's a real issue, and because we should rightfully be merciful to people in chronic pain, there's going to be some leakage. It's going to happen. So the question is, what do you do about it, and how do you treat people humanely, and how do you help people deal with whatever that pain may be that is driving the problem?
The reality is also that most people who take even the most risky drugs, drug addiction, suffer no significant harm.
Well, if you look at heroin, there's an incredible study that was done of the American soldiers in Vietnam. And something like 50% of them became physically dependent on either opium or heroin. So they were getting withdrawal when they stopped. Only about 20% of them continued to use once they were physically, I'm just trying to get these figures straight in my head, hold on. So, but basically what ended up happening is 20% of them, I think, used once or twice when they got back to the United States. But only 1% of them stayed addicted to opiates long term. Now, some of them switched to alcohol. But the fact is that the people, they had this population, a reasonably traumatized population, exposed to large amounts of opiates, and they came home and they were okay for the most part. So, we focus too much on the substance. We think that, if we just got rid of heroin, if we just got rid of alcohol, if we just got rid of marijuana, we're going to solve this. It just doesn't work that way. And the addiction rates for recreational opioid use tend to be about 15%. That's similar for cocaine and methamphetamine, although those addictions tend to be shorter lasting because you just can't stay up all night for too many years. And so either they quit or switch. Alcohol and opioid addictions can last 20 or 30 years. You rarely see that kind of daily stimulant use like that. So anyway, the most addictive drug in terms of the percent of people that it captures is cigarettes, and that's like 30%.
I have this argument with a friend of mine who said, why do we always have to couch this in terms of harm reduction when the number of people suffering harms is so low? Why do we never have a personal liberty discussion?
I think the personal liberty discussion doesn't help. I think you can make a rational argument that, yes, if we are humans, we should have the right to do with our consciousness as we will, so long as it doesn't harm other people. And why should it be okay to do this with alcohol and not LSD? That's a good rational argument, but it doesn't convince a parent who has seen her father suffer from opioid addiction and does not want her child to suffer from that. So I think, there are harms related to substances, and the people, if you're talking about millions of people in the population, 10 to 15% is not a small percent. We need to take care of those people, and we need to, be sure that they are not damaging other people. And anybody who's had addiction in a family knows that typically they are harming other people.
What do you make of the Portuguese system? I think I get the impression it's not well understood. The same friend I was talking about. I don't think he's alone in believing that the floodgates have been thrown open and it's a libertarian paradise. Whereas in fact it's quite the opposite.
Well,
it's very much, it's decriminalisation, it's not legalisation. Is it working?
It does seem to be working in terms of that they have lower rates of use and death than in the rest of Europe. So in terms of dealing with the problem that they set out to deal with, it definitely has been effective. In terms of liberty, if you keep getting caught repeatedly, first time you get caught, you get something like a caution. I think the second time you get sent to a dissuasion committee, and they have powers like taking away your driver's license or even taking away your passport. And telling you you're not allowed in certain areas and stuff like that if you don't go to treatment. So it's a bit more controlling than people think it might be. The question of whether a system like that is going to work or not revolves around how big a net you're going to throw, because you could basically arrest 50% of high school kids for smoking pot if you wanted to. So, if you are if you are just basically focusing on people who are nuisances, you're probably going to end up doing a lot of good with a system like that.
So discretion is important in any system like that?
Absolutely.
Because you have written more than once that in terms of drug support and treatment, coercion is a bad thing and does not work. There's quite a lot of coercion in that Portuguese model.
There is, except that there's not the ultimate coercion, which is prison. So coming from an American perspective, I'm like, yes, that's way much of a step forward. I think coercion is complicated because there's all different types of coercion. And there's, Mark Kleinman, for example, has a system that I think is actually a really reasonable one where it doesn't actually exist in its ideal form, but its ideal form would be if you get arrested for possession, you get sentenced to not use that drug, and then you get drug tested. And if you test negative, you're fine, you don't need to go to treatment, all is well, it just goes away. If you test positive, I think the first time you get 2 days in jail, but it's never more than 2 days in jail. And so it's basically using principles of behaviorism, which is that if punishment is swift and certain, you're much more likely to change your behavior than if it's like uncertain and extreme. Because so you get 15 years on your second, like how are you going to learn from that? You're just going to learn to be better. If you keep messing up in this system, you get offered the option of treatment, and you get to choose your own treatment. And so this way, it dissects the treatment system from the incarceration system, because right now, about half of the people in treatment in America are coerced there. This does not make a good environment for people who want to recover. This also does not make a good environment for counselors who are working in the most effective fashion. And the most effective fashion to work with people for any condition is empathy and respect. If I come in and I say, I'm not really sure I have a problem, there's ways of working with unmotivated people. But generally saying, you must admit you're an addict and you must, do this and that, people are just like, they want to say F you to that. This is not the way you work with people to be effective. And in fact, there's a very famous study of confrontational counseling in alcoholism by William Miller. And I think the title of the study is something like, the more the counselor confronts, the more the client drinks. And
so tough love doesn't work.
No, tough love absolutely doesn't work. I wrote a book called Help at Any Cost, which traces the tough love boot camp industry. What I found there was these kids were sent to these places where they would be humiliated, attacked, physically punished in really horrible ways, denied sleep, denied bathroom access. Just gross, horrible, actual torture. And what did you get out of that? PTSD and addiction. You don't get in depression and suicides. You don't get people, we don't think like, oh, what little children need is more abuse. So why would abusing teenagers fix them? It just doesn't make any sense.
How much treatment and counselling is given to people in America who perhaps don't actually need it? I'm thinking of the 20-year-old who gets busted with an E on his way to an EDM festival. What are you treating that?
Well, right, no, and I think there's also in Philadelphia, I know of a person who works with drug users, and basically a lot of the people are dealers that are getting busted, and they just say they're addicts so they can go to treatment, and what do you do with that?
Which actually turns out to be a massive waste of resources.
It is a waste of resources, and it means that the resources go to the wrong place, and the people who really need help can't access it. And then if they do access it, they're put in with a bunch of people who either don't need to be there and don't want to be there, or who are just pretending. And especially since you really need to be pretty open and honest to recover, it just does not. Again, it's kind of senseless.
That's often a characteristic of drug courts, which we have quite often had presented to us as a better way forward. How will the drug courts work?
Well, it's very hard to tell because they work on the principle of self-selection. So basically, the people who are going to do well anyway get sent to the drug court, and then the drug court gets credit for their recovery. So, how well is it working? I don't know if we can really say. It's certainly better than sending somebody to prison for 15 years, which is a mandatory minimum that I actually faced in New York under the Rockefeller laws. Obviously, if that's what you're talking about, this is a good alternative. The problem with drug courts is that judges are not doctors. And we have a system there which basically says, I'm going to send you to X treatment. And how does he know that, or she know that that's the right treatment for that person? A lot of drug courts will not use maintenance treatments, which are the most effective treatments for opioids. And they cut the death rate amongst people with opioid addictions by something like 60 or 70%. This is methadone and Suboxone, and this is not using it for detox. This is using it for long-term treatment. The World Health Organization, the CDC, the Institute of Medicine, everybody has agreed that this is the best treatment we have for opioid addiction. But, of course, judges don't like it because it's not very punitive. So they want to put people on naltrexone so they, get no natural opioid high either. Now, let me say that naltrexone helps some people, and it should be an available option, but a doctor should be deciding, the doctor and the patient together should be deciding what works. We don't have diet courts. We don't say, okay, you're too fat, we are going to, you had a cookie, now you go to jail. Like, we don't work that way. And yet, addiction, which is very similar, and there is food addiction, addiction, which is very similar, we seem to, treat in a completely different way.
One of my readers wanted me to ask you about ibogaine for alcoholism.
Ibogaine for alcoholism?
Yeah.
Okay, so ibogaine...
There is a program in Dunedin.
Oh, interesting. Okay. As far as I know, ibogaine has a potential hazard for the heart. I think it's the heart, and you really need to do very good monitoring. It's also the case that, and I think this is one of the best stories in the addiction world, so I'll tell it briefly. I was speaking with Howard Latzoff, the guy who discovered ibogaine, which is this psychedelic drug that gives you this very intense trip and does actually relieve opioid withdrawal. So basically, you take this stuff, you don't experience opiate withdrawal, you do experience an incredibly intense and I think vomiting-filled and very difficult sort of trip. And then you wake up and, 3 or 4 days later and you get after all these dreams and visions, and you are no longer physically dependent on the opioid. And I presume it works similarly with alcohol, and people have used it for cocaine and other. The problem is this. So he was a junkie. He was shooting up. He was trying all kinds of different drugs. It was the 60s or 70s. And somebody gave him some ibogaine, and he tried it, and he woke up, and he didn't have any heroin withdrawal. He's like, yeah, wow, I am free of heroin addiction. Yay, great. I'm going to go and try to patent this stuff because this is really, cool. And he gave it to a couple of his friends, and they, went through the whole thing, and they're like, that was interesting. Now I want to go score. Because of course the physical dependence is not the problem. The problem is having a life without meaning and purpose. And in those instances, those people, their meaning and purpose was, I'm going to be a heroin user. And so if you didn't, again, do I think it should be tested? Yes. Do I think it should be available as an option as long as it's safe? Yes. And in fact, even if it's slightly unsafe, if it's the only thing that somebody with an opioid addiction, which has a 1% at least death rate per year, if it's the only thing they'll consider, well, okay. But I think, again, is it going to be a cure-all? No, we're probably not going to see a medication that's going to be that. We can certainly have medications that can help people a lot better than they're currently being helped. But it's a more complicated problem than that.
No, there was also LSD, some good results for LSD in treatment of alcoholism before that was banned, and more recently MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder.
Again, I think psychedelics can be really, really useful. I mean, I remember during my own addiction that I was like, somebody wanted me to trip with them, and I'm like, no, I don't want to take acid because I think I'll find out I'm a cocaine addict, and I really don't want to know that, so I'm not going to take it. I do think psychedelics can be useful, but again, like any kind of one-shot thing, it's, it'll look great on TV. This is part of why the confrontational therapies have been so attractive. Like if you put them on Dr. Drew or, and you show some really tough stuff and then the next day they're better, it's great, it's dramatic, it shows lots of cool stuff, but does it actually work in the long term? Not without a lot of other support.
Right, we nearly have to wind up, but you, as Ross noted, came here to write about our bold new liberal experiment in science-based experiment in drug regulation. Things changed after you booked your flight. What's the story going to be for you now?
I'm interested in what went wrong. I'm still also really interested in how do you determine, how do you as a regulator or a legislator, if you wanted to go about this in a rational fashion, how do you do it? What is low risk? How do you define that? I think the whole world really does want to know that. I do think, the fact that Obama allowed Colorado and Washington to go forward with their experiments, the fact that people here did go for this in an overwhelming way before there was a backlash, and now that people are thinking about, maybe the first one of these things we should have tried was marijuana rather than some synthetics that we really haven't any experience with, like long term. So I think there is a shift. I think the economy will not allow us to continue this drug war. So as much as it is horrible to have world economic problems, I think that might be one good side effect. And I also think that people are becoming more aware that you can't solve it this way. That we're having, they put stuff in OxyContin, the painkiller, so that you can't shoot it, and people are just going to heroin. And somehow they didn't realize that this would happen. So I think people are beginning to see that this is a really complicated problem, and that there's actually things we know that can help people deal with it. We actually have some pretty decent therapies for addiction. The problem is we don't use them, we don't get them to the right people, we don't make them available right when people need them, and we also use drug policy as a political football rather than a actual policy. The politics of it has so overwhelmed. It goes back to it goes back to Anslinger, it goes back even further. It's always been a let's use this to get some alien group thing rather than how do we actually solve a health problem. And I think I'm interested to know how you guys were planning on looking at it as a health problem, and hopefully in future may do.
You also spent some time in Auckland with Matt Garvin, who seems still set on his dream of creating the perfect recreational drug, the low risk, high efficacy, high. Is it a desirable goal? Do you think you'll get there?
I am not so sure he would get there, but I do think, would it be really nice to have a drug that makes you feel more social, that you could maybe drink at a bar and then not have a hangover? Yeah, that would be nice, Would it be nice to have something that could, send you on some philosophical and trip without harming yourself, of course, why not? I think, like, why is it okay to go skydiving or bungee jumping or to climb Mount Everest, which has a 1 in 3 death rate, although I think it's slightly better now, but they just had all that problem with the Sherpas. But, again, like, why is it okay to do those things? And it's actually lower risk to shoot heroin than it is to climb Everest. Why do we see one thing as a bold journey, even though that mountain has long been conquered, and the other thing is you're a scummy, horrible, bad person? We need to investigate our values, and humans have always wanted to get high in various ways. So can we do it safer? That's a great goal. How many drugs do you get with no side effects? Pharmaceutical industry has been trying this for a long time, and there's very few of them. So, yeah.
Is it still the role of the state to pick winners? To say, for instance, that methamphetamine, this seems too risky to us, especially the forms it's used, but maybe we can get rid of it? Which is what we were trying to do with the subregion.
Right. I actually think yes, because I think, if you look at the world before we had the FDA, in America that regulates the drugs, which was the first attempt to do this, you had kids getting poisoned on cough syrup. You see that in China now where they don't have very much regulation. You want to at least have regulation that says, I know what this stuff is. It's been tested to X extent. I think the FDA is actually a really good model for what you can do. Like, do I want the state controlling my every move? Obviously not. But do I want to know that when I buy a product at a store, it's not going to be poison? Yes.
And on that note, perhaps we'll go to some questions. Yes.
On alcohol? No, it's probably worse, actually.
Apart from the drinking age.
Well, yes, we do have a higher drinking age, but as we note with our high college binge drinking rates, this has not been incredibly successful. In fact, I think Canada has a drinking age of 19, and they have the same amount of drunk driving crashes as we do. And the real thing that everybody credited the higher drinking age with was fixing the drunk driving crashes. Well, what it was really doing was it was making the age standard, because if you, I used to live in a town, in fact, where there were 20 bars and 20 gas stations, because the drinking age in my town was 18 and the drinking age over the state line was 21, so everybody came to my town to get wasted. It was uniform that made sense. And I tend to think that 19 actually makes much more sense than 21, because basically that means everyone in college can drink. And, are you going to drink more at a party with your professors, or are you going to drink more at a frat party? I think the answer to that is generally obvious, although some professors might disagree.
So science doesn't always inform policy. It really always the White House and the drug policy office has traditionally been really bad. It's now been guided by the OECD. Is that shift? Is it a good thing?
I think it would be a good thing if you were allowed to speak honestly about marijuana. There's actually a law in place that says that the drug czar may never speak positively of any attempt to legalize anything. And so basically that means they're mandated to lie, even if the truth says that, even if there's overwhelming data that this should help. I think it's absolutely wonderful to have a person in recovery in that position. But it's also the case that sometimes people in recovery have felt that their means of recovery is the one true way, and that all other means of recovery should not be offered. And also that they sort of have this feeling that, like, well, we need the toughest laws possible so that I can avoid relapsing. And if they thought about that sensibly, they would be like, well, okay, I became addicted in the first place despite the current extremely tough laws. Why would this work now? But again, so I think that's definitely better than having a law enforcement person there. I ideally would want a scientist in recovery. Well, it's interesting because Matt Bowden would say BZP is the answer. I don't think anybody's actually studied this question, so I will not say anything one way or the other on that. But I do know that there have been a few studies attempting to do maintenance on Ritalin or on modafinil. And those have shown some promise, but it's so politically touchy that I don't think, some of those were actually done in the United States. And there's certainly a lot of research, going forward on that. I think stimulants, because they tend to be used in a binge pattern rather than every day like heroin, it's harder to find a maintenance that will be effective. But, this is something they're certainly looking for. And I think also the thing to keep in mind with stimulant addictions is that they do tend to be shorter lasting. It's like the period in which you can, go on a meth binge for a week and then sleep for a week and then, it just wears down your body too much. So like I was saying earlier, people will either switch or, get into recovery. So I think the real thing there is, do these people have ADHD? Okay, let's deal with that and get them on a stimulant that will be safer. Do these people have depression? Do these people, not have education? I think, we need to work on all the psychosocial pieces of it as well, because that's really, at this point, the best thing we have for that. Right. That's... Right. It's interesting because, again, antidepressants have such varied reactions. It's been very useful for me, so I would say that, some people that would be a fabulous thing and other people it would not be, because I think what's really interesting is the pharmacology here. It's like, I can take an antidepressant and most people will be like, oh, that makes you horribly numb. Well, I'm always extremely oversensitive, so if I go to a little bit numb, that's great for me. But if I'm like down here and then you're putting me even further, no. So, if your friend has ADHD, which is a conceivable possibility, Ritalin might be a thing to... right. Well, in that case... I would have to say that, that's why we should have been having perhaps a different discussion here, where there could have been some synthetic that might have been, potentially okay. I think one of the things that's really difficult about creating any kind of FDA for recreational drugs is that, with Prozac, they tested it for 6 months. I've been on it for, 20 years or whatever. Maybe that's bad for me. I don't know. I think it's not bad for me. But, we're all guinea pigs in some ways.
They tested it for 6 months and they fudged the results. Yes.
Kava I have not heard about. I have heard about kratom, which I may be pronouncing incorrectly. And that seems to be something that seems worth looking into, but I don't really know enough to comment on that. Yes. Well, some would argue that that's what the 12 steps do when they work. I think that, because basically like helping like one addict, helping another, like that is really powerful, and you can really get a great sense of meaning and purpose by helping other people. So in that sense, yes. There's also the whole spiritual piece in the 12-step thing, and a lot of people do find a sense of meaning and purpose from religion. So you could argue that all the religious programs, which to many eyes include the 12-step ones, do that. I think that, lots of programs include an employment and an education piece to get at that. But there's not that many things that get at it explicitly, and I'm not necessarily sure it would be good to get at it explicitly. I think actually some of the most interesting addiction programs that I've ever seen are not about addiction at all. A friend of mine runs a program where basically they train people to be AIDS counselors, and you don't have to be in you don't have to be in recovery. You can still be using. You can just it. But a lot of people there are in recovery in various ways, and a lot of people come in to that they're using, and they're like, wait a minute, this person can do it. Maybe I can do it. So, and that gives them a marketable skill. So I think education style programs are very good, but again, it really, really needs to be individualized, because if you get, some CEO who has a cocaine addiction, I don't think the guy needs job training. Maybe he needs to go, I don't know, work with poor people or something, but, it really needs to be, because the problem is that those things are very hard to find, and, the other great source of that obviously is love, and, I can't assign you to fall in love with somebody.
Yes, and that.
No, it's been classic scaremongering. We had the so-called bath salts cannibal, this guy who bit somebody's face in Miami. He was not on bath salts. But now everybody thinks that bath salts make you into a cannibal. The media does very poorly with drugs for multiple reasons. One is that they tend not to focus, I've been covering this for a long time, so I know what's nonsense, but most people, there's just sort of, go write about this, and then they come up with the conventional wisdom and the stereotype stuff because they don't know who to talk to, and they don't know any better. And scare stories really do sell papers. They get clicks, and the big change I have seen though is that on the internet, you can immediately see all the critiques of the cannibal bath salt coverage.
And strawberry myth.
Yeah. There's, you can go to Snopes and see these, the urban myths about these things debunked. It's also, there's an active community of people who, including myself, who will just, if somebody writes a really ludicrous story, will say, this is ridiculous. For example, there was a story that came out recently about marijuana damages the developing brain, and it was like, okay, first, and it was casual marijuana use damages.
Casual marijuana use causes changes in the brain.
Right, but suddenly that headline became damages, and even changes is actually inaccurate because it was a one-time fMRI scan, so you cannot say cause and effect based on that. The differences that they saw in these people's brains could have been because those were people who were predestined to like cannabis. So the other problem with it, though, the overwhelming major problem with it was that the people in that study, which was only 40 people, there were 20 controls, and the other 20 people smoked 11 joints a week, which is hardly casual marijuana use. And, however, they were completely normal. They didn't allow into the study anybody with a psychiatric problem, anybody with a problem in school, anybody who wasn't generally doing really well. So basically, these changes aren't linked with any behavioral problems. So I can show you a scan of a man and a woman, and I can show you brain differences there. Does that mean that the woman is, or the man is defective or damaged? It's just a silly, ridiculous thing. And if you knew the first thing about being a neuroscience journalist and what fMRI can show and what it can't show, and even common sense should tell you that if there's no behavioral changes, we don't even know if it means anything. Everybody is wired differently.
And yet, if you Google that study, the first 3 or 4 pages will be the original news reports, and you might occasionally find a debunking blog.
Is it really that bad? I guess my own...
I was shocked. I actually did it this week and prepped for discussion because we had a guy called Thomas Lumley here did a really good job of deconstructing the study and linked to various other people who'd done the same thing. I thought that was great, and I was actually shocked that basically the Google results were flooded with the original incorrect news stories.
See, now this is where it becomes a real problem that Google personalizes search, because of course I get all the debunkings. So I'm going to have to start.
So I thought I would too.
And you were using your own computer.
Yeah.
Ah, right. Well.
Maybe it was the search terms.
Yeah, but that is interesting, and that is a huge problem.
Good. You're right. Yes, Jackson.
Well, I think they could first be honest about their own drug use. I think they, at least in their own head, they don't even have to come out about it, but be honest that, like, you weren't damaged by it. If you were seriously damaged by it, you were unlikely to be in your job now. And so, okay, so that's one. Also, think critically. Think critically about, journalists are, there's this old saying in journalism, like, if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out. Actually be that kind of skeptical journalist. Like, if the government tells you something, don't believe it. Like, check it and make sure. Also in terms of stigma, I think the term drug abuser should never be used. Child abuser is immediately what you think of, and the vast majority of drug users are not drug abusers, and how could you abuse a poor little drug anyway? It's a stupid word. The DSM dropped it because it's stupid, so don't use that word. I think we should also try to minimize the use of the word addict and just say people with addiction. We don't say schizophrenic anymore. We don't, autistic people actually prefer autistic people to people with autism. So in that case, you should use the language that the group prefers. Now, there may be differences among the autistic community, in which case you'll get yelled at by somebody. But again, I do think that person-first language is good in addictions, because at least it makes you think of a person, not a category. And yes, it's clunky, but it's useful.
Coming on to Ross.
Yeah. Right. I mean, this makes it hard. But interestingly, at least in the United States, the recovery activists are pushing the person with addiction language. And so I think they think that that's okay to say in private in their meetings among people who are, I think that's good. Yes.
Coming back to the neuroscience, I'm interested in that as well, because my two sons are both on the autism spectrum, and I have long felt that having them was a great benefit to me as a journalist, because it actually helped me understand a lot. Once I understood how they were different, I understood a lot about how everyone is different.
Yeah.
And could then extend empathy more easily.
I mean, it's funny actually, because I probably if I were a child today, I would have been diagnosed as Asperger's 100%. As a child, I completely had all of the behaviors and the weirdness and the social cluelessness and the taking everything literally and etc. Yes, I think knowing affected people, you can't empathize with somebody you don't know. It's very, very hard. And humans have a natural tendency to form in-groups and out-groups. So the more inclusive the in-group is, the better we will do on so many different dimensions, but in particular on disability and brain differences. I mean, I like the whole idea, the autism community has this idea of neurodiversity, and the idea that, we're all wired differently, and that differences are sometimes associated with handicaps, but that doesn't mean that those differences aren't also associated often with benefits. And, like today, if I were being seen by a child psychiatrist when I was 3, I was reading at 3. That would be a symptom of hyperlexia. It's also like being a smart kid. So, we need to balance this urge to pathologize and the knowledge that we are all physiologically different and also all human. And those physiological differences, if we could just understand that there aren't good drugs and bad drugs, there are good drugs for some situations and people and bad drugs for some situations and people, we would make enormous progress, I think. And I think knowing people who are wired differently definitely makes you see that.
Oh, one more thing.
Well, that's an interesting thing, because for me, I do kind of wish I had been labeled, because in the absence of being given a label, I just thought I was selfish and bad and horrible. And that led to a lot of self-hatred, and that led to a lot of depression, and that led to addiction. So in that case, the label probably would have been helpful, but then some little kids interpret the label as being, well, I can't be social then. Instead of this allows me to understand that A, there are other people like me, and B, that I'll have issues with this, but I can be helped with this. So labeling is an obsession of mine. And in fact,
Really?
in fact, in my book, I am looking at all this, which I am jokingly calling the first Asperger's addiction memoir. But it's really sort of more focused on what drug policy, what this overview that I've had based on these personal experiences can bring to it, hopefully.
Well, best of luck with that book. And I think if there's one word that's come up again and again in this discussion, it's empathy. And I think that's the real key. So thank you, Maia.
Thank you very much.